Achin Vinayak, a freelance journalist, is actively involved in various social causes such as civil liberties, anti communal, and anti nuclear movements. He has been a member of the Free University of Black Studies, London. He was also a member of the expert group set up to evaluate India's national literacy mission. Achin Vinayak is currently visiting professor, Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia University. He is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several very important books. His recent book is Communalism Contested. This book provides a synoptic overview dealing with the relationships between nationalism, communalism, secularization, religion, modernity, and fundamentalism. Achin Vinayak is a Marxist, and his approach towards contemporary issues has a very deep progressive thrust. We have invited Achin Vinayak and Kamal Chinoy to discuss some very vital issues of our times through the book Communalism Contested.
It seems that, to paraphrase Marx, since you are an unabashed Marxist, that you believe that the best way to fight communalism is to understand it, and thus the title of your book, Communalism Contested. And you sort of draw the link between religion, modernity, and secularization. But before we get into the relationship between religion, modernity, and secularization, I think the most current issue at hand, on which there is much debate, is the relationship between what is real secularism and the state. So perhaps if we first discussed the entire notion of secularism, what is secularism? The so-called Nehruvian version of secularism, which is supposed to be westernized, as contrasted to the so-called Gandhian notion, Sarva Dharma Sambhav, the idea of equal tolerance for religions. I think that would help set the terms of debate of what you really want to deal with. And then perhaps we could go into the entire question of then secularism versus pseudo-secularism. So how do you think your book, in a sense, makes an advance in this area?
Well, I think one distinguishing point about my book is the emphasis I give to the question of the secularization of civil society. Of course, the whole issue of secularism, whose basic reference point is the state, is very important. And I take the view very strongly that when we are talking about the secularity of the state, secularism, what we mean by this is not Sarva Dharma Sambhav, but what we mean by this is a principled separation between the apparatuses of the state, of the government and so on, and religious power and influence, a principled separation. And this is important because you mentioned the whole question of pseudo-secularism. The forces which are against secularism are by their very nature against democracy. And I think it's very important to understand the relationship between secularism and democracy, and it can be put very simply. You can have a secular state, for example, like China or the former Soviet Union or Turkey at a point. You can have a secular state which is not democratic, but you cannot have a democratic state or society in which the state is not secular. And those forces that are attacking secularism will perforce also have to attack democracy. And one of the reasons, a stimulus for writing this book, is because we are living in times in which there are very powerful forces in India which are attacking secularism and democracy. I could go on a little bit further if you like, and there are three crucial conditions for what we understand by a secular state, and they have to do with the relationship between the individual, religion and state. So you've got three things: individual, religion and state, and you've got a set of relations between them. First, there is the relationship between individual and religion, and a secular state and society is one in which there is freedom for any individual to worship as they please, the relationship between individual and religion. The second is the relationship between the individual and the state. And here it's very important that state or the principles of citizenship are not connected to any property that one category of people have but other people do not have. In other words, you cannot connect the question of state rights, rights of citizenship, and make them the property of a particular group which is white, or a particular group which has a particular religion or a particular class and so on. It must be uniform and available to all citizens. And the third thing is, of course, the relationship between the state and religion. And what we mean by a secular state is a state which is not affiliated to any religion. An example of a state which is not affiliated and therefore cannot be democratic for a section of its people is the Jewish state of Israel. It cannot be democratic for Palestinians by its very nature of being a Jewish state. That's why things like a Islamic state or things like a Hindu state have to be by their very nature anti-democratic.
But what about the entire argument of those who think that Indian democracy must have a majoritarian aspect, and who therefore coined this term pseudo-secularism to basically refer to minority appeasement? And the argument being that since the majority of people are Hindus, therefore the state, since it must be majoritarian, must be in broad terms Hindu. And therefore their argument that any individual expression of religious sentiment or even of artistic sentiment, say paintings or drawings of Hindu goddesses, that affronts, as it were, representatives of the majority community, is automatically in that sense undemocratic or anti-democratic. And therefore any tolerance by the state of such activity, much less protection for such activity, is essentially an assault on the majority. How would you look at that?
Well, you see, this connects to the point I was saying earlier. One has to be very careful. It's very clever what the forces that are attacking democracy and secularism are doing in this country. They're not attacking it frontally. They're attacking it indirectly through the process of redefinition. So when they're not attacking democracy frontally by saying that we're against democracy, what they're really saying is that we are the best Democrats. It's the same thing with secular. You are the pseudo-secular. You are the pseudo-democrat. You are the pseudo-liberal. We are the true Democrats and we are the true secularists. See what they're doing, for example, with the question of religion. It's a very simple thing. Doesn't democracy mean that majority opinion or majority rules or majority decides in some way? Yes, provided you understand what that notion of majority is. Now their claim is that aren't the majority of people in India Hindu, and therefore doesn't democracy in India mean that the wishes, the interests, the opinions of the majority of the people in India be taken care of or seen to, and that's democracy. That is not what democracy is. It's as ridiculous to say, for example, that the majority of people are white in Britain or the United States of America, and therefore the interests of white people must be secured first and foremost, and therefore a democracy only exists that. It's not that, because the principle of majority in a democracy is a principle of the majority of citizens. You can't have a majority determined by a particular category of people who belong to a particular religion or have a particular culture and so on. That's why when we talk about democracy and majority, we're always talking about flexible majorities. We're talking about a principle of citizenship which is not connected to a fixed property which only some people can have and other people cannot have. But since we live in societies in which there are considerably important majorities of, say, white people or a majority of people belonging to a particular linguistic group or so on, in order to protect that and not allow that particular group to have too much power, because that exists, like for example white people, you have to have what are called minority rights.
But I think you also make the point earlier in the book, using Romila Thapar and others' arguments, that actually the Hindus are a fairly conglomerate and a polyglot pluralistic lot. And therefore, the entire that argument in her article, Syndicated Moksha and so forth, that actually this is an artificially constructed majority.
Oh, absolutely.
And as the entire debate over Mandal, the reaction to the Mandal Commission, the various interstate river water disputes and so forth show that the Hindu majority is actually a political construct, an artificial one. And Hindus are as divided on caste, community, linguistic, regional lines as are other religious communities in India.
Oh, absolutely, I agree with you completely. In fact, it's very, of course, you have forces which are trying to construct this artificial majority, and to some extent, in some cases, they are succeeding. But the actual living reality of Hinduism as it is lived is that you're talking about an extraordinarily diverse phenomenon. And the same thing also implies incidentally to Islam. This whole business of an Islamic Ummah that exists worldwide is nonsensical. There are about 12 different kinds of Islamic civilizations. What is the cultural commonality between the Bosnian Muslim and the Xinjiang Uyghur Chinese Muslim, and the Malay Indonesian Muslim, or the West African Muslim, Arabic Muslim, and the Moorish Muslim and all. But there again you have this same pretentiousness of trying to make out that simply because they share one particular religion, Islam, or certain precepts in that, therefore they constitute one monolithic community. In the case of Hinduism, it's even more difficult. You have such an enormous diversity of gods, goddesses, practices, and so on, that the best way to understand Hinduism, in my view, is precisely as a kind of compendium of a whole variety of sects and practices.
No, but then the question is that why is this notion of Hinduness or Hindutva growing? I mean, your last chapter in the book deals with the communalization of the Indian polity. Actually reflects on all the central concerns in your book, which have been sort of brought together. And you see the rise of communalism in the Indian polity. Now, a very standard argument in other works on communalism really link the sudden rise of communalism, both majoritarian and minority, with various, as it were, concessions by the secular state. In particular, the reversal of the Shah Banu judgment, the Muslim rights bill, the rights of women on divorce bill, which overturned the Shah Banu judgment. And around the same time, the breaking open of the locks of the Babri Masjid, allegedly under Congress influence, later followed by a Shilanyas at the site by the then Congress Chief Minister of UP. And so basically there is a view that the then ruling party, the largest secular party in the country, the Congress, in fact, in accordance with a certain theory of vote bank politics, actually first appeased one and the other religious community, and in fact laid the ground for a further communalization of the Indian polity, apart from weakening its own status and sort of contributing to its own decline. How do you see these phenomena?
Well, my short answer would be yes and no to what you say. Yes, obviously the Congress politics and practice in the past has helped to promote the rise of communal forces. It's important here to recognize that what we're dealing with is not something called minority appeasement or appeasement of particular minorities, majorities. What you're having is the appeasement by the Congress and other parties of communal forces in different religious communities, which is different from saying the appeasement of Muslims or the appeasement of Hindus or Sikhs or Christians and so on. You're talking about appeasing communal forces there. Let's not talk about appeasing.
Then a gender-specific appeasement. I mean, the Muslim women suffered from the overturning of the Shah Banu judgment.
The point is that a lot of this politics has been going on for quite considerable time. Why is it that it becomes much more important after the 70s, in the 80s, and so on? And here, of course, if you like, there are certain levels we have to understand in terms of trying to understand how this phenomenon of majority communalism has emerged and become stronger. And one, of course, is especially since the early 70s, of a decline in the general socio-economic and political conditions of vast majority of people in this country. If you had a situation like, for example, in East Asia, in which there was very considerable growth and prosperity, you would have a different situation. Take a country like Malaysia, with large, different Muslims, Tamils, Chinese. Because of their phenomenal growth and success, the last communal right was somewhere in 1965. That's what. Second, of course, is that the growth of forces of Hindutva has taken place in a political vacuum which has been created by the decline of the old Nehruvian ideology and the Congress party. If you like, the relationship between the rise of the BJP and the Sangh and the Congress is not that the rise of the BJP has enabled the Congress to decline. It's the other way around. It's the decline of the Congress, historically speaking, that has promoted the rise of the BJP. And the third point I want to stress here is that you also are dealing with a particular force which has pushed an ideology which is very, very dangerous and which is looking for issues like Shah Banu, like Ayodhya, etc., on which to mobilize and polarize Indian society. And I want to explain this a little bit more clearly. Supposing you belong to a force which says that the only way India can become strong is if Hindus unite. Right? Then the question is, how do you go about uniting Hindus? Now, you can only do it in two ways. You can either try to establish some principle of unity, which is internal to Hinduism, which is very difficult. Your only candidate is a kind of loose and accommodating Brahmanism, but because of the enormous diversity, you can't do it. It also divides many people who are Hindus against others and so on. Your other principle is the one that these forces have emphasized more strongly, and that is that you try to unite Hindus against something outside. And therefore, in this particular case, it is uniting Hindus against the Muslim other. So, you have a political force which is looking to mobilize by raising things which can be some example of Muslim appeasement and so on. Look at what they have done with the Shah Bano case. They have made this into, in fact, not just the forces of Hindutva, but even communal forces on the other side. They have made this into a Hindu-Muslim identity issue, when actually the fundamental issue is that it is an issue of the oppression of women and children. The absence of a uniform civil code is not a Hindu-Muslim issue. The absence of a uniform civil code is a question of the oppression of women and children of all communities. And believe me, the Hindu personal laws, which may be slightly better than the Muslim personal laws, are also extremely deficient.
There was a massive riot in Ayodhya in 1934. The central dome of the Babri Masjid was virtually destroyed. It was rebuilt with punitive fines imposed by the British Raj on the local residents. In 49, there was the forcible insertion, according to the police records of the time, of the idols during a Congress government, allegedly linked to internal Congress politics, and the forthcoming by-elections in Faizabad, where the attempt was to defeat the socialists who defected from the Congress, mainly Acharya Narendra Dev and Acharya Kripalani. Now, this is 1949. There are sporadic attempts throughout to make this an issue. People like Ram Chandra Das, the priest, and others are involved in this. Why does it become such a big issue in the 80s when it could not become such a big issue earlier?
Well, I'll give you two. One, of course, is the general context of politics, the decline of the Congress in the 80s, which was not there earlier on. The second thing which is very important is that you had a political party which systematically mobilized around this issue. You see, the anger that was constructed is a constructed and artificial act. It doesn't mean that it's not genuine and felt, but it was. And this is where I want to take up the point. You see, the point is not even so much whether or not a temple existed there. That's not the issue so much. The issue is that, okay, you have this artificial building up of an anger which is quite different. Look at the arguments that many of the supporters of the demolition of the Babri Masjid gave. They said, look, so many temples in the past were destroyed by Muslim elite. What are you complaining about? If we want Kashi, Mathura and Ayodhya, there are only three that we are arguing for. This is a very common argument. But this is where the question of modernity must come in. And it's very, very important to understand how dangerous this kind of argument is. In the past, when temples were destroyed, whatever the reason, sometimes they were destroyed just to gain wealth and so on, it offended the people who worshipped in that particular temple, which was usually caste affiliated or sect affiliated. That's all. And people lived in a radius of 25 kilometers. Those people in that area were upset. So that was the effect. Nobody was saying, when they were destroying those temples, that whether you support our destruction or you oppose our destruction, this is an assertion of your identity. Are you with us or for us? In modernity, what has happened is that on this one issue, people in their millions up and down the country are being mobilized on a platform of hatred, quite unlike thousands of temples or whatever that may have been destroyed in the past. In other words, I'm saying that this one mobilization, this one issue has created more hatred on such a mass scale than anything in the past of India. Isn't it amazing that you have people who are living in the United States of America, who have a green card, who don't wish to come back to this country, but who have got worked up and angry about the Babri Masjid Ayodhya issue, even though they don't even want to come back to this country. Obviously, this is an anger which is created on a scale and a depth through politics of mobilization in a way that is completely different and has created a kind of levels of hatred and opposition. That's why you can't compare, if you like, what I mean, the intolerances or the politics of shrine destruction of the past with the politics of shrine destruction of the present.
But isn't this also a very modern instrumental use of religion? I mean, the whole, as it was, Semitization of Hinduism. So you have an avatar of Vishnu, Lord Ram, whose birthplace suddenly becomes exceedingly important. And the fact that there are a number of other Ram Mandirs in Ayodhya itself. There are other masjids, including the Begumpura Masjid in Ayodhya, which is built around the time of the Babri Masjid, similar structure, again no minarets and so forth. All that somehow manages to be sidelined, and you have prior and after the destruction of the Babri Masjid almost uncontested claims that there should be no non-Hindu shrine because there are gurdwaras also there in Ayodhya, within the Panchkosi, variously interpreted between 5 and 15 kilometers of Ayodhya. And the shocking thing is that somehow it is uncontested, and there seems to be a kind of common sense that in a sense what happened to the Babri Masjid was in a sense a rectification of a historical wrong, and the entire the reach, the depth of sentiment that has shown itself as a fairly consolidated force, not only now, it's clear from the last elections in North India, is linked to a certain perception of righting of historical wrongs, and also to a certain perception that somehow the majority has been oppressed by minorities. It's not only the Muslims. We know that there are now problems with other minority groups from the Sangh Combine, including Christians in the northeast and in the south. So, is this linked to a certain kind of weakness in Indian nationalism? Because you use the term in your book, the battle for the soul of Indian nationalism. Yes, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'll come to that, but let me take up one point in what you said, which I think is very important. You made the point about the instrumental use of religion. In fact, the forces who talk in the name of Hindutva are the people who are using religion and Hinduism in the most instrumental way. In fact, the biggest sufferers are not going to be minority communities. The biggest sufferers are going to be Hindus themselves, because what they're doing in many ways is such a deep betrayal of many of the most important precepts of philosophical Hinduism and so on. This is the utterly cynical and instrumental use for clear political purposes.
Actually, if I just may make a point here, before the demolition, there was a leveling by the state government of various smaller shrines, the Falhari Baba Mandir, the Sankat Mochan Mandir, which led the UP Legislative Council to say that this was the largest single destruction of Hindu shrines by any government. So right. Obviously there was a political, not a religious motive.
Right, and I mean I couldn't agree with you more. And of course, at the end when you talk about this being connected to nationalism, exactly, you are having a battle, as I've said in my book, a battle for the soul of Indian nationalism. You are having one group which is saying that we understand best what Indian nationalism is, and we understand best how to make India great, and that the way for India to become great is to recognize what it considers to be its cultural essence, and it also promotes a question of a belligerent, aggressive notion of what the India they want should be. Now this has to be contested and fought with a notion of India which is much more tolerant, humane, democratic, secular and decent. And unless other political forces are prepared to mobilize on this ground and fight against this, then of course you are not going to be able to stop it. Let me take the Ayodhya example and point out the difference. If political parties had got together and mobilized in front of Ayodhya and said, in front of the Babri Masjid and said, you cannot touch Babri Masjid because Babri Masjid is not a Muslim monument. It is an Indian monument that belongs to me, just like the Golden Temple belongs to me, just as the Bomb Jesus Church in Goa belongs to me as an Indian, just like the Birla Mandir belongs to me as an Indian. And don't reduce this to being something which is simply a Hindu temple or a Muslim thing or whatever. And we were prepared to mobilize people and said, don't you touch Babri Masjid because this is part of my Indian heritage. It is a fight which takes place at the economic level. It's a fight that takes place at the political and social level. That's why the question of Mandal is very, very important. And these are the directions.
And also the women's bill.
And the reservation for women. Greater empowerment of tribals, ordinary people and so on. In other words, you cannot separate the fight against communalism from the fight against all other kinds of evils. There is no such thing as, fighting first against this and then later about that. And you have to fight for democracy at the deepest sense in all kinds of ways. That's why, for example, the whole question of the new economic policy also comes in. If you have an economic policy that creates greater inequality between richer and poorer, then this is also going to affect negatively the struggle against communalism. And perhaps I should also say one thing, that when we talk about fighting communalisms, I want to stress that we have to fight all kinds of communalisms simultaneously. That is to say, we have to fight minority communalisms and majority communalism because they both feed on each other.
Achin, it's obviously impossible to recapitulate all the themes in this book. In a sense, we've just scratched the surface, and it is a book which readers would do well to read. But I think the basic message in the book is that the infirmities in current Indian nationalism are linked to the developmental path we have followed and its breakdown, and therefore communalism will have to be looked at more than just an ideology, but a reflection of our times and what has happened to our country. Thank you, Achin.
Thank you.